In hospitals, homes, and emergency rooms across the United States and the United Kingdom, adults who survived critical moments often describe experiences they struggle to explain. They don't claim scientific proof. They don't present medical conclusions. They simply share what they personally felt or believed during moments when their lives seemed to slip away. Tonight, we examine 10 accounts from people who say they died briefly according to their own perception and returned believing they carried a message. These are subjective experiences, retold carefully and responsibly, without asserting medical truth or supernatural fact. Now, let's begin. Mark Turner never saw himself as the kind of man who would talk publicly about a personal experience he couldn't explain. He was an engineer, the type who double-checked numbers, corrected blueprints, and quietly fixed structural issues other people missed. He lived in Columbus, Ohio, in a modest brick house he bought in his early 30s, long before conversations like this ever entered his life. Nothing about him suggested he'd one day describe an experience that would alter how he viewed his time on Earth. He considered himself rational, private, and firmly grounded in the physical world. Concrete, steel, angles, loads, cause, and effect. But life doesn't ask who you are before it interrupts everything. It was a cold evening in late January when Mark's story began. He had been working long hours, finishing a project for a manufacturing company just outside the city. It was the type of project he loved. Clean numbers, a clear blueprint, a technical solution that required deep focus and late nights. He hadn't been feeling well for days, a subtle pressure in his chest. Not painful, just unfamiliar. He ignored it at first, told himself it was stress, skipped lunch again, stayed at his desk past dinner, and walked to his truck sometime after midnight, with a headache and an unsettled feeling he couldn't quite place. When he arrived home, the house was still. He'd been divorced for 2 years, and the quiet didn't bother him. He set his keys down, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table, scrolling through messages he planned to answer in the morning. He didn't feel the moment coming. No dramatic collapse, no panic, just a sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion. He stood up, and the world slipped away from him. He remembers the sensation with surprising clarity. Not pain, not fear, just absence, as if a switch had been flipped and everything familiar dissolved. According to the paramedics' report, Mark lost consciousness. He did not, and could not, recall the details of what happened medically. He never attempted to explain it. He never described physical conditions or diagnoses. He left all of that to the professionals. What he describes instead is what he felt during those minutes where everything went quiet. He says the first thing he noticed was the stillness, not darkness, just stillness, like stepping into a vast space without walls, without sound, without any sense of direction. He couldn't tell whether he was standing or floating, or simply existing in a suspension that didn't require physical form. He didn't see a tunnel or figures or landscapes. He didn't see memories or visions. What he felt was more like a pause, an interruption in momentum. Imagine driving down a road and suddenly the vehicle stops moving, but you don't feel the brakes. That's how Mark describes it. Then came the sentence, not spoken, not heard, just formed, as if it appeared fuckily assembled inside his awareness. Take care of what you keep putting off. He says the message wasn't forceful. It didn't sound like a command. It didn't feel emotional. It simply existed. Present, steady, unmistakable. He remembers thinking he understood exactly what it meant without needing clarification. He had put off too many things. The apology he owed his younger brother after an argument that drifted into silence. The call he'd promised his mother, but always delayed because work came first. The friendships he neglected, convinced everyone was too busy for reconnecting. The project he dreamed of building, a small community workshop for aspiring engineers who couldn't afford formal schooling. He had a long list of things he planned to do when life slowed down. But life never slowed down, The sentence repeated once more, not louder, not sharper, just present. Take care of what you keep putting off. Then the stillness broke. Mark remembers a sudden rush of awareness, like being pulled from underwater. The next thing he knew, he heard voices, real voices, urgent, layered, pulling him back into the physical world. When he opened his eyes, paramedics were already working beside him. He was disoriented, still processing the transition between the quiet space he remembered and the bright, bustling reality around him. He didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure he could, but inside his mind, the sentence repeated like a stone dropped into calm water, rippling outward. At the hospital, as he recovered, nurses asked him simple questions to check his orientation. Doctors monitored his vitals. He gave clear answers, stayed cooperative, listened to their instructions, and followed their recommendations. He didn't tell anyone about the sentence. Not that day, not for weeks. He wasn't afraid of being judged. He wasn't worried about disbelief. He simply didn't know how to explain something that didn't fit neatly into categories. He didn't treat it as a supernatural vision or a medical explanation. He treated it as a moment, one that felt real and meaningful to him, nothing more and nothing less. When he was discharged, Mark walked into his house with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The silence of the living room no longer felt empty. It felt like a reminder. That evening, he picked up his phone and called his brother. They didn't talk about the argument. They didn't revisit old wounds. Mark simply said, "I'm sorry about everything." And his brother, surprised but receptive, replied, "I'm glad you called." It was a simple conversation, but to Mark, it felt like completing the first item on a long-delayed list. Over the next week, I visited my mother. I reached out to college friends I hadn't spoken to in a decade. I sorted through projects I abandoned halfway. I even looked up community organizations that might support the engineering workshop idea I had always pushed aside. I didn't become a different man overnight. I didn't make dramatic declarations or sudden lifestyle overhauls. I simply started doing the things I had postponed. Every time I hesitated, the sentence returned to me, "Take care of what you keep putting off." I eventually told a close friend, the only person I trusted enough to share the experience with. My friend listened, nodded, and said, "Maybe that was your mind telling you something you already knew." I accepted that possibility. I'm not interested in arguing interpretations. I don't push others to believe anything. I don't present the moment as proof of anything beyond my personal experience. What matters to me is simple. It changed how I see the time I have. I now live with a quiet awareness that some opportunities don't wait forever. Some apologies don't stay possible. Some dreams expire if you refuse to move toward them. I once built structures that stood for decades. Now, I'm trying to build something in my personal life that lasts just as long. To this day, I describe the experience the same way. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was my brain reacting to stress. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't claim to know. I only know the moment felt real and the message felt true. And I'm trying to live in a way that doesn't ignore it. For a man who spent his whole life trusting numbers, equations, and measurable outcomes, a single unmeasurable sentence became the most important blueprint I ever received. Rachel Carter lived a life shaped by structure. Every morning she woke at 6:30 a.m., brewed a cup of tea, and reviewed her lesson plans for the day. She taught primary school in a quiet suburb of Bristol, UK, a job she genuinely loved. Her students adored her steady patience, her habit of turning simple tasks into small adventures, and her way of explaining complicated ideas with soft clarity. She wasn't dramatic, impulsive, or prone to exaggeration. Anyone who knew her would describe her as dependable, measured, and calm, even when life wasn't. That's partly why the moment she later described left such a deep and lasting impression on her. It was early spring when it happened. One of those gray Bristol mornings where drizzle falls lightly enough that you don't bother to call it rain. Rachel had taken the day off for a minor medical procedure recommended by her physician. There was nothing serious about it, nothing that caused fear or panic. She expected to be home by evening, sipping tea on the sofa while reading through her students' recent writing assignments. But life sometimes folds in on itself at unexpected angles. She remembers the preparation phase clearly, being greeted by the nurse, answering routine questions, changing into the gown, and feeling that quiet mixture of boredom and anticipation people experience in hospital rooms. She remembers closing her eyes, and then she remembers opening them somewhere entirely different. Not physically, not literally, just in her mind, in her awareness. In whatever space she felt herself inhabiting while unconscious, she found herself standing in a hallway. It wasn't a hallway she recognized from any building she'd ever visited. It looked old, wooden floors, wooden walls, warm amber light without a visible source. There was no ceiling light, no lamps, no windows. Yet everything was gently illuminated. The hallway was narrow at first, but widened as it extended forward, eventually disappearing into a soft, unfocused glow. On her left side, several doors were evenly spaced. On her right side, nothing, just a smooth wooden wall polished to a reflective sheen. She didn't remember walking into this place. She didn't remember moving at all. She simply was there. She felt no fear, only curiosity. The opening was small, just enough to reveal a sliver of dim amber light inside. I didn't approach immediately. I stood still, feeling a strange mixture of hesitation and invitation. I didn't know whether I was meant to go forward or backward. The hallway felt neutral, waiting for me to decide. Then I heard it. Not a voice, not a sound, just a question forming in my mind with the clarity of spoken language. If you go back, will you use your time differently? I didn't know where the question came from. It didn't come from the open door. It didn't echo from the hallway. It didn't have a tone, gender, or direction. It simply appeared. I tried to answer it, but I couldn't. Not because I lacked words, but because the question required an honesty I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. Use my time differently? What did that mean? I lived simply. I taught children. I volunteered occasionally. I wasn't reckless or wasteful, but I knew I'd been holding back parts of myself. Dreams I'd brushed aside, ideas I never pursued, promises I made to myself but never followed through on. The hallway waited. Something about the slightly open door drew my attention again. If it hadn't been open, I might have walked past it. But there it was, a crack of space, a suggestion that something was inside waiting for me. I stepped toward it. The floorboards under my feet felt real, smooth, cool, lightly creaking with my weight. I rested my hand on the edge of the door, intending to push it gently. Before I did, the question repeated. If you go back, will you use your time differently? This time, I understood the weight of it. Not a demand, not a threat, just a moment of reflection placed in front of me like a choice. The inside of the room was dim when I pushed the door open. I saw what looked like a small wooden table, a chair, and a stack of papers. I couldn't make out the writing on them. I couldn't see any shapes or figures. No one was inside, only quiet, a quiet that felt like waiting. I stepped back into the hallway. That was the moment I woke up. The hospital lights were bright. Nurses were speaking to me. I felt the familiar heaviness of returning consciousness. Someone adjusted my oxygen mask. Another nurse checked my pulse. A gentle voice told me everything was all right. I blinked repeatedly, trying to register the transition between the hallway and the hospital bed. I didn't attempt to explain what I just experienced, not because I feared judgment, simply because I didn't know how to wrap words around something so still and internal. I stayed in recovery until the staff cleared me to leave. I walked back to my car with careful steps, sat inside, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. The question from the hallway echoed in my mind with unnerving precision. The phrase "go back" stuck with me, as if it implied I had stepped away from something, briefly, momentarily, before returning. I drove home through a light rain. The city felt the same, but I didn't. My house felt the same, but my decisions didn't. Over the following days, I became quieter, not withdrawn, but thoughtful. I made small changes at first. I started journaling again, something I loved years ago but abandoned because teaching consumed my time. I joined a community writing group I had always wanted to attend. I began volunteering after school more consistently, staying later to help students who struggled with reading and mathematics. But the real shift came months later. I had always wanted to study educational psychology, to understand how children learn, how early experiences shape emotional development, how teachers can support students facing unseen challenges. I shelved that dream in my early 20s, believing I didn't have the time or the confidence. After the hallway, I applied for evening courses. I didn't tell anyone about the experience until months later, when a close colleague noticed my sudden motivation and asked what inspired the change. I tried to explain the hallway, the wooden floors, the open door, the quiet question. My colleague listened carefully and said, "It sounds like your mind knew what you wanted before you did." I accepted that possibility. I didn't call it a vision or a message or anything beyond a vivid internal moment. I didn't frame it as supernatural or medically significant. I simply treated it as an experience that gave me clarity at a time when I felt stuck. I say the hallway was not a place I visited. It was a moment I encountered, a moment that asked me a question I had avoided for years. And every time I feel myself slipping back into old patterns of hesitation, I remember the slightly open door and the quiet prompt. If you go back, will you use your time differently? For me, the answer is finally yes. Daniel Moore was the kind of man people described as steady, not loud, not dramatic, not the type who chased adrenaline for fun. At 42, he worked as an aircraft mechanic in Wichita, Kansas, a job that demanded precision, patience, and clear thinking. His hands were skilled, his routine consistent, and his life quiet. In a way he found comfortable. He'd been warned to sit down beside the workbench. He didn't panic. He didn't assume the worst. He told himself it was exhaustion, maybe dehydration, maybe the result of too much coffee and too little sleep. Then a sharp, sudden pressure in his chest forced him to stop. The next minutes blurred. Co-workers calling emergency services, the ride to the hospital, the bright lights moving overhead. He drifted in and out of awareness with no sense of time. And then, without warning, everything went silent. He didn't hear machines. He didn't hear voices. He didn't hear anything at all. What came next wasn't dramatic or fantastical. It was simple, quiet, and strangely ordinary. He found himself sitting on a metal folding chair in what looked like an empty airplane hangar. The space was massive, wide concrete floors, high ceilings, steel beams running in crisscross patterns overhead. But there were no tools, no aircraft parts, no parked jets. Just a single beam of natural white light falling from a skylight onto the chair he sat on. The air felt still, cool, and clean. He stared into the open space, unable to place how he'd gotten there. He wasn't afraid, only aware of an odd calm, the kind that settles into a person when they're too tired to resist whatever comes next. He stood. His footsteps echoed, clear, sharp, real. The acoustics of the hangar behaved exactly as they should. The floor was cold against the soles of his boots. The space smelled faintly of old metal and dust. He ran a hand along one of the steel support columns. It felt real, smooth, solid. He considered calling out, but something stopped him. Not fear, just the sense that noise didn't belong in a place this still. A faint, mechanical hum broke the silence. He looked toward the far end of the hangar. A man was standing there, not close enough for Daniel to see his face, not far enough to be a silhouette. Just a blurred figure wearing what looked like a work jacket and jeans. The man raised a hand in a gesture that didn't feel like a greeting or warning. Just an acknowledgement, Daniel hesitated, then walked toward him. The man didn't move, didn't speak. But the closer Daniel got, the more something familiar settled into the air. It wasn't recognition, not in the facial sense. It was more like remembering a voice before hearing it. When Daniel stood roughly 20 feet away, the man finally spoke. "You still have things you haven't done yet. You weren't finished. Why a hangar?" "Because you understand it. When he was younger, he wanted to build his own ultralight aircraft. Not for work, not for money, just for himself. You set your own dreams aside. You were never supposed to. You go back, finish what you put off." The floor lost its texture. The steel beams dissolved into white. The last thing I heard was the man's final sentence. "Don't waste the chance again." When I opened my eyes, I was back in a hospital bed. Someone was calling my name. A nurse leaned over me. Machines beeped steadily. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after the soft white of the hangar. I breathed slowly, waiting for my mind to settle. I didn't tell the hospital staff what I saw. I didn't tell my co-workers. I didn't even tell my family, not immediately. I needed time to understand it myself. In the weeks that followed, I felt a shift. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just a steady internal realignment, like tightening bolts on loose parts. I began clearing space in my garage. I found my old notebooks where I'd sketched ultralight designs. I researched materials, budgeting, regulations. I started working evenings, not because I was rushing towards some symbolic goal, but because I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Months passed before I spoke about the hangar experience to my younger brother. I didn't label it. I didn't call it supernatural or medical. I framed it plainly. I saw something that reminded me I wasn't done yet. My brother didn't question the details. He could see the difference in me, the focus, the calm determination. Today, the ultralight isn't finished, but it's real. The frame stands solid in my garage. The engine sits mounted. The wings are in early construction. I work on it slowly and carefully, the same way I approach everything mechanical. And every time I tighten a bolt or sandpaper, a joint smooth, I hear the same steady voice in my mind. You weren't finished. I don't claim I died. I don't claim I visited another world. I simply say I was given a moment of clarity in a place that resembled the beginning of my life's path. A place that felt like a reset point. A place that told me I still had work to do. On an ordinary Tuesday morning in Bristol, I walked into the cardiology wing for what I expected to be a routine diagnostic scan. I was 58, practical, level-headed, and not the sort of woman who dramatized discomfort. I'd spent decades running a small bookkeeping business from home, raising 2 daughters and handling life's difficulties with a quiet resilience. I felt slightly lightheaded during the pre-scan prep, but brushed it aside. I had skipped breakfast, after all. But halfway through the procedure, while lying still under the machine, a wave of dizziness hit me hard enough to blur my vision. I managed a single breath before everything folded inward like the closing of a book. The next moment, I was standing, not lying down, not being lifted, standing. And I was in a place I recognized but hadn't visited in decades. A narrow neighborhood street in Easton, Bristol, the same one I walked every morning in my 20s on my way to the bus stop. But there were differences, subtle yet unmistakable. The buildings looked freshly painted, as if preserved at the exact moment I had last seen them. There were no cars, no people, no movement except a soft wind brushing the leaves of a small tree rooted in the concrete near the corner shop. The stillness wasn't eerie. It felt intentional. I turned slowly, absorbing the scene with a mixture of disbelief and familiarity. I could smell the faint scent of summer rain on warm pavement. I could hear the gentle hum of something distant, though I couldn't identify its source. Everything around me carried the clarity of a memory sharpened beyond natural limits. I took a few steps forward. My shoes clicked lightly against the pavement. The sound was real, precise, grounded. I stopped at the bus stop where I used to stand with a leather satchel slung over my shoulder, waiting for the number 48. The plastic seat was the same off-white color, slightly stained from years of use. The route map was unchanged. Down to the smudge on the corner where someone once spilled ink, I reached out and touched the edge of the shelter. It was cool to the skin. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't imagination. It wasn't a dream with soft edges. It felt like stepping directly into a preserved moment of her own life. A voice spoke behind her, soft, measured, clear. "You stopped living for yourself." "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "You stopped living for yourself, Margaret." She stiffened, not because the statement felt wrong, because it felt too accurate. She had built a life defined by service, quiet, reliable service. "You were allowed to want more than that." She whispered, "I had responsibilities." "You did, and you fulfilled them. You're not being judged, only reminded." "This street," she murmured. "A time when you still dreamed freely," he said. In her 20s, she had wanted to study architecture, but her life had shifted rapidly. A job to support her partner, then unexpected bills, then children, then everything else that pushed her dreams into storage, like forgotten boxes in an attic. The designs were vibrant, tiny row houses along the Avon River, a reconstructed community center she once imagined for the Eastern District, a set of minimalist homes powered by solar ventilation long before such ideas became common. She felt a swell of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I don't understand. What am I supposed to do?" "Start small, but start. You owe yourself that much." "Wait, will I remember all of this?" "Yes, that is the point." But something had shifted in her. For the first time in years, I expressed my own wants rather than my duties. I remembered something I had forgotten for too long. You were allowed to want more than that. Stopping just a few feet away, she observed him, not with curiosity, but with a recognition tinged with a profound, almost weary kindness. Jonathan's mind, a repository of Latin names and statistical models, raced to categorize her. Not a threat, not a hallucination, he told himself. The clarity was too sharp. A park ranger? No. Her clothing was generic, and no ranger would be here, in this impossible place. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice tighter than he intended. "How do you know what I do?" A faint smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know a great many things, Jonathan. For instance, I know you can identify the call of a veery by its single spiraling note. I know you find comfort in the predictable chaos of a wolf pack's social structure. I know you believe the universe is a grand, intricate equation, and if you just have enough data, you can solve for X." The specificity of her knowledge sent a jolt through him, cold and sharp. It was one thing to guess his profession. It was another to know the intimate details of his work. "Am I dead?" The word felt alien and clumsy in his mouth. "Dead is a label," she said, turning to walk slowly toward the gray fence. "A very final one. You've always preferred precision. Let's just say you're between chapters." She paused, looking back at him. "You asked where we are. A better question would be, when are we?" He didn't follow. The scientist in him reared up, frustrated. "That makes no sense. Time is linear. It's a constant." "Is it?" She gestured for him to join her. Reluctantly, he walked beside her, his boots sinking into the unnervingly perfect earth. "You spend your life observing systems from the outside, Jonathan. You document the chase, the hunt, the birth, the decay. You see the patterns, but you don't feel the terror of the elk or the relief of the doe. You study life, but you've forgotten to live yours." They reached the fence. The wood was smooth, weathered by a sun that didn't exist in this sky. Jonathan ran a hand over it. It felt solid, real. "Look over the fence," she said softly. He did. The hills on the other side were the same, hazy and distant, but the meadow was different. It wasn't the uniform, silent grass of where he stood. It was a riot of color and movement. Wildflowers, black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, Queen Anne's lace, swayed in a breeze he couldn't feel. Bees, heavy with pollen, drifted from blossom to blossom, and in the distance a young boy with a shock of brown hair was laughing, running with a clumsy golden retriever puppy that kept tripping over its own paws. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He knew that boy. He knew that dog. They were from a photograph his mother kept on her mantle. A life he'd barely lived before his family had moved, before the dog had been hit by a car, before he had learned that it was safer to observe than to lose. "You see?" the woman said, her voice a low murmur beside him. "This place is a collection, the moments you measured and the moments you missed. The fence isn't to keep things out. It's to remind you of what you've chosen to leave behind." He stared, his scientific mind grasping for a label. Hallucination, memory, vision, and finding nothing. For the first time since he'd woken in this meadow, Jonathan Reed, the man who trusted only what he could prove, was utterly silent. The logic of natural systems had failed him. He was left with only the quiet, terrifying logic of a life half-lived. You've spent years analyzing patterns, but you haven't noticed your own. I'm not sure what you mean. You do. His job had consumed the last 10 years. Long months outdoors, unstable schedules, constant travel, endless funding proposals. His relationships had thinned. Friends eventually stopped inviting him anywhere. Birthdays slipped by. Saturdays became workdays. He loved conservation deeply, but somewhere in the pursuit, he had stopped caring for himself. You promised yourself a life outside your work. You promised balance. I've been busy. You've been gone. Why show me this? Because continuing the way you have been will cost you more than you understand. You've spent years analyzing patterns, but you haven't noticed your own. I'm not sure what you mean. You do. His job had consumed the last 10 years. Long months outdoors, unstable schedules, constant travel, endless funding proposals. His relationships had thinned. Friends eventually stopped inviting him anywhere. Birthdays slipped by. Saturdays became workdays. He loved conservation deeply, but somewhere in the pursuit, he had stopped caring for himself. You promised yourself a life outside your work. You promised balance. I've been busy. You've been gone. Why show me this? Because continuing the way you have been will cost you more than you understand. At 49, Elaine Porter lived a life defined by schedules. She worked as a train operations coordinator in Manchester, a job that demanded precision, adherence to time, and a calm response to unexpected delays. Every day was a sequence of arrivals, departures, and carefully managed logistics. It suited her. It kept her focused. It kept her moving. But the structure also left little space for anything else. Her friendships faded. Her marriage ended quietly. Her hobbies slipped away without ceremony. She didn't resent her life. She simply adapted to it until adaptation became the only thing she knew. One evening, on her walk home from the station, she felt a sudden tightness in her chest. Not pain, just pressure. Sharp, brief, but unmistakable. She paused near the edge of a tram platform, steadying herself against a railing. The ground tilted, her vision blurred, her knees weakened. There were voices, distant, muffled, meaningless. A hand on her shoulder, a shout for help. And then, silence. She opened her eyes, expecting a hospital ceiling, fluorescent lights, or at least some sign of urgency. Instead, she was sitting on a wooden bench beside a railway track, but not one she recognized. The platform was old, decades old, weathered beams, brick walls stained by time, a faded timetable board with peeling paint. The lamps glowed with a dim amber light, far too warm compared to modern LEDs. It resembled a British station from the late 1970s or early 1980s. The most striking detail was the absence of people. No passengers, no staff, no noise. Even the rails were still, as if no train had passed through in years. Elaine stood slowly, her breath visible in the cool air. She looked down at the rails, rusted, dusted with leaves, but perfectly straight. She examined the timetable board out of instinct. Only one departure was listed. She stared at the word. It wasn't a place. It wasn't anything she'd ever seen on a map. A faint vibration rolled through the platform floor. Not loud, not alarming, just enough to make her turn toward the far end of the track. A train approached, but not a modern one. It was an old diesel multiple unit, green and cream exterior, rounded edges, the kind of train she saw only in historical archives. Its headlights cast long beams of pale light across the empty rails. It slowed as it neared the platform, brakes releasing a soft metallic whine. The train doors didn't open. Elaine stepped closer, heart steady but alert. The windows were opaque, impossibly opaque, painted from the inside or frosted beyond transparency. No silhouettes, no movement, no indication that anyone was inside. A voice spoke from behind her, soft, familiar, patient. "You've been missing from your own life, Elaine." She turned. A man stood a few feet away, dressed in a simple charcoal overcoat. She didn't recognize him, yet his presence felt strangely familiar, like someone she should have remembered but had forgotten through inattention rather than time. He gestured toward the train. "It's waiting for you." Elaine swallowed. Waiting for me to do what? The man's expression didn't change, but his tone carried a note of gentle firmness. "To acknowledge what you've avoided." She looked at the timetable again. "Resolve." She whispered, "I don't understand." The man stepped nearer, his shoes making no sound on the platform. "Your life has become obligation layered upon obligation. You fill every gap with responsibility. You organize everything except your own well-being." Elaine bristled, not defensively, but because the truth landed too precisely. He continued, "You haven't chosen anything for yourself in years. You only respond." Her mouth went dry. She thought about the marriage she stayed in long after affection faded. The career she maintained, not because it fulfilled her, but because it kept her useful. The friends she stopped seeing because she didn't want to admit she was lonely. The dreams she dismissed because she no longer believed she had time for them. She asked quietly, "What does this have to do with whatever this is?" The man nodded toward the train. "This is your reflection, a place built from your own sense of direction, or lack of it. I don't know what I want. What do I want? The art supplies I used to keep in a drawer. The hiking trail near the Peak District I always wanted to explore. The pottery class I once considered enrolling in but never did. The quiet desire for companionship I never admitted aloud. Before I go anywhere, I need to know something. Is this real? I understand. Good. Then you're ready." Elaine blinked, and she was back on the tram platform in Manchester. Paramedics kneeling beside her. A passenger held her handbag. Another shielded her from the chill wind. "Elaine, can you hear us?" She nodded slowly, grounding herself in the familiar. A city street, neon lights, distant traffic, the deep hum of evening commuters. But something had shifted inside her. In the weeks that followed, she didn't speak about the platform or the train. She didn't claim she died or visited another world. She didn't assign labels to the experience. She simply changed. She reduced her overtime hours. She reconnected with her sister. She joined a pottery class in Chorlton. She started painting again, small watercolors of industrial Manchester landscapes. She took 2 days off and hiked alone through the Peak District, something she'd postponed for nearly 15 years. Colleagues noticed she smiled more. Friends noticed she replied to messages without delay. Her daughters noticed she sounded lighter on the phone. present in a way she hadn't been in a long time. When someone asked her why she finally made time for herself, she gave a quiet answer. "I realized I've been running trains on everyone else's schedule except my own." She doesn't mention the word resolve. She doesn't mention the train that waited for her. She doesn't mention the man who reminded her of a truth she'd buried. She carries the message silently. Your life doesn't need to be rebuilt. It needs to be reclaimed. And for the first time in years, she feels like she is finally stepping onto her own platform rather than watching trains pass her by. Mira Hale was 34 the day her routine quietly changed. She worked as an environmental analyst in a wide, sparsely visited valley. Solitude wasn't something she resisted. It was something she relied on. One late afternoon, she was preparing to wrap up her field notes when the weather shifted unexpectedly. In that region, sudden gusts and cloud cover could sweep in without much warning. She gathered her equipment to head back toward her vehicle, but a sharp tremor underfoot made her lose balance. Her boot slipped on the uneven ground, and she dropped to her hands and knees. Her vision dimmed. Then everything faded. When she opened her eyes, she was standing upright in a place she didn't recognize. The landscape was an open stretch of smooth, pale terrain with a sky that glowed softly. The air felt still. The ground beneath her looked untouched, as though nothing had ever passed through. She turned slowly, trying to understand her surroundings. Only one structure existed on the horizon. A large circular form rose from the ground. Neither metal nor stone, but something in between. It stood taller than a person, perfectly symmetrical, like a crafted frame set into an otherwise featureless expanse. Mira approached the structure with steady steps. Each footprint she made appeared in the surface briefly, but faded immediately once she moved forward. The ground refused to remember her presence, returning to perfect smoothness behind her. She reached the circular frame. Up close, its surface felt warm and smooth, without marks or texture. There were no symbols, no obvious purpose. A gentle shift in the air met her, cooler, with a faint vibration beneath her feet. It wasn't strong enough to alarm her, only noticeable. Then a calm voice spoke from behind her. "You've been observing life without letting yourself be part of it." Mira turned. A person stood several steps away, appearing as if they had simply been there the whole time. They looked to be older than her, dressed in simple, neutral clothing, with a relaxed stance and steady expression. "Who are you?" she asked. The person didn't answer her directly. Instead, they touched the edge of the circular frame. The person's voice remained calm. "Allow yourself to participate again. Let your interactions matter. Let them leave impressions." Mira frowned. "That sounds broad." A faint smile touched the person's face. "Then consider a simpler version. Return, reconnect, be present in your world." The soft light around them brightened. The landscape grew hazy. The air folded into white. The final words she heard were, "Stop standing just outside your own life." She was back in the valley, seated on the ground where she had fallen. "I lived a quiet life in Portland. At 62, I worked as a librarian in a small coastal branch, where the smell of old paper mixed with salt air drifting in from the harbor. My days followed a calm, familiar rhythm, shelving returns, answering research questions, recommending novels to patrons who trusted my taste. I was content, or at least I told myself I was. My husband had passed away almost a decade earlier, and though I kept busy, my world had tilted inward. My son lived across the country in California. My friends were scattered, and I often went days without meaningful conversation outside work. On a late autumn evening, while preparing to close the library, a sharp dizziness overtook me. I steadied myself against a shelf, blinking until the room stopped spinning. I tried to take a step, but my knees gave out. My vision narrowed, my breath thinned. The library lights blurred into streaks. And then everything went still. When awareness returned, I was no longer lying on the carpeted library floor. I was standing on a small wooden pier at the edge of a lake I had never seen before. The air was clear and cool, carrying the crisp scent of pine. The water was still, smooth as glass, reflecting a mountain range that didn't match anything in Maine. The sky held a soft twilight glow, neither sunset nor sunrise, just an in-between light that felt suspended in time. I wrapped my arms around myself, not out of cold, but disbelief. The pier beneath my feet creaked faintly. Old boards, weathered, familiar, though I couldn't place why. She stepped forward cautiously, the wood groaning under her weight, in a way that reminded her of her childhood summers on my grandparents' lake near Concord, New Hampshire. But this lake was far too large, vast, stretching beyond the horizon, the far shore disappearing into mist. Something about this place, the stillness, the isolation, felt deeply personal. I walked to the edge and looked down into the water. My reflection stared back, but younger, perhaps 45 instead of 62. Different hair, different eyes, a different posture, more assured, more alive. I touched my cheek instinctively. The reflection didn't mirror the gesture. My breath hitched. A voice from behind me broke the silence. You stop looking at yourself with honesty. I turned sharply. A woman stood at the start of the pier, tall, thin, wearing a long gray coat and dark boots. Her hair was tied in a neat bun. She looked to be in her 70s, but her posture held a firmness that defied age. I felt a strange recognition, like I was meeting someone I should have known but never had. The woman stepped forward slowly, her gaze steady. You pretend you're fine, but you've been carrying years of unspoken weight. I swallowed hard. The words weren't harsh. They weren't accusing. They were simply true, in a way that made my chest tighten. Loss carved a hollow space in your life. Instead of filling it, you learned to walk around it. Tears welled in my eyes, unbidden. I've managed. You survived. But you stopped living. Is this a dream? It's a moment, a necessary one. Why am I seeing this? To remember that you once wanted more from life than routine. The library, the quiet evenings, the empty house, the habit of filling silence with small chores just to avoid confronting loneliness. I felt exhausted, emotionally, deeply. What do I do now? Start. Start what? Start allowing life to reach you again. Will I remember this? That's the reason you're here. You have more life left than you think. Don't spend it hiding from the world. Ma'am, can you hear us? I remembered that life still wanted something from me. Start allowing life to reach you again. Michael Harris lived a life that appeared steady from the outside. At 45, he ran a small woodworking business out of a converted garage behind his home in Savannah. He built tables, restored antique chairs, carved custom pieces for local shops. His hands were calloused, his routine predictable, his demeanor quiet. But inside, order had slowly been replaced by unease. His marriage had ended the year before. His daughter, now in college, rarely visited. The business still ran, but the joy of creating had thinned into routine production. Most days, he worked in silence, broken only by the sound of sandpaper or the buzz of a saw. One humid summer evening, after pushing himself through a long day of sanding a reclaimed oak dining table, he felt a wave of dizziness sweep over him, sharp, sudden, and disorienting. He steadied himself against the workbench, but the floor shifted beneath him like a boat in rough water. His ears rang. His vision dimmed. He lowered himself to the stool, but his knees buckled. The workshop dissolved into darkness. When awareness returned, he was standing upright, not in his workshop, not anywhere he recognized. He stood inside what looked like an enormous workshop, but not built by human hands. The walls were made of smooth stone, carved with geometric patterns, each line perfect, each angle seamless. Overhead, warm white light filtered down from a ceiling so high and hazy He couldn't see its edges. The air smelled of cedar mixed with something clean and metallic. Workbenches stretched across the room, dozens of them, each one holding a wooden object at a different stage of completion. Bowls, chairs, figurines, small boxes, even pieces that looked like architectural models. He stepped forward, boots echoing softly. The nearest workbench held a wooden sculpture, half carved, half raw. Its unfinished sections were rough. Its completed sections were precise and beautiful. The sculpture was unmistakably one of his early designs from a decade ago. He froze. He hadn't thought about that piece in years. He'd sketched it during a hopeful period of his life, but abandoned it after the divorce began shifting his world. He reached out and touched the wood. Warm, smooth, alive, a voice drifted across the workshop. "You left too much unfinished." Michael turned sharply. "What is this place? You build for others. You repair for others. You meet others' needs. But you stopped building anything for yourself." "I didn't have time. Life had taken too much from me. I tried, but things didn't work out. You once created because it gave you meaning. You carved to understand the world. You built to express who you were. Now you carve only to fill hours. Are these mine? Every project you abandoned." Michael's throat tightened. He walked slowly down the aisle, passing unfinished chairs he once dreamed of selling, a music stand he promised a friend but never finished, the wooden toy boat he planned to give his daughter before the divorce dimmed everything. He reached the last bench. It held nothing, just a block of untouched wood. The man appeared beside him. "This is what remains of your future if you continue as you are." Michael felt something break inside him. Not pain, not sorrow, but a deep, hollow recognition. He whispered, "I don't know how to start again." The man shook his head gently. "You do. You're just afraid it won't matter." Michael turned to him, desperation rising. "Then why show me all this? Why now?" The man placed a steady hand on the unfinished block. "Because you still have time." The workshop lights brightened, as if responding to the words. The far walls blurred. The carved pattern softened into white. The man spoke again, voice calm but resolute. "Finish what matters, not what pays bills, not what fills hours." Michael exhaled shakily. "What if I fail?" The man looked him in the eyes. "Failure is part of creation. Emptiness is not." The room trembled softly. The benches faded. The walls dissolved. The ceiling vanished. The man's final words echoed. "Return to your craft, Michael, not as work, as life." A sharp inhale pulled him back. He opened his eyes on the concrete floor of his workshop. The oak table stood beside him. His tools were scattered. The fluorescent light flickered faintly overhead. He sat up slowly, breath unsteady, trying to anchor himself in reality. He didn't tell the paramedics what he'd seen when they arrived. He didn't mention the workshop of unfinished dreams. He didn't describe the craftsman who knew him better than he knew himself. He carried the moment quietly. In the following weeks, Michael changed in ways no one expected. He began carving again, small pieces, personal pieces. He restarted the sculpture he had abandoned a decade earlier. He built a wooden music box for his daughter and mailed it to her dorm. He created a new shelf in the workshop labeled "For Me" and gradually filled it. His business didn't change dramatically, but he did. When friends asked why he suddenly seemed lighter, more invested, he always said the same thing: "I remembered why I started carving in the first place." He didn't describe the vast stone workshop, or the unfinished projects, or the craftsman who waited patiently for him to understand. He kept only the message: finish what matters. At 41, I worked as a long-haul truck driver based out of Liverpool. I spent most of my weeks on the road, moving goods between cities. I liked the solitude. I liked the freedom. I liked the sense of forward motion, even when my life felt like it wasn't moving much at all. But silence can become its own kind of trap. For years, I avoided thinking too long about the parts of my life I'd let slip past me, the relationship I couldn't repair, the friends I stopped calling, the family I kept at a polite distance, the dreams I left behind in my 20s when responsibility arrived too early. One rainy evening on the M6, after driving for 13 straight hours, fatigue struck harder than expected. My eyelids felt heavy. My mind drifted. I blinked to stay alert, telling myself to push through another few minutes. Then a jolt, a sharp, crushing pressure in my chest, a sudden spin of darkness. I had just enough awareness to pull the truck onto the shoulder before everything shut down. When consciousness returned, I wasn't in the truck. I was standing in the middle of an empty motorway. Same road markings, same asphalt texture, same reflective paint on the barriers. But there were no cars, no distant engines, no wind, no rain. The world around me was still, unnaturally still. Above me, a muted gray sky stretched without clouds or motion. The air held no temperature, no humidity. It was neither cold nor warm. It simply was. I stepped forward. My boots echoed faintly, a sound that felt wrong on a motorway. The silence was so complete it pressed against my ears. I walked several yards before noticing something ahead. Not a motorway sign, not something used in the UK. It was a freestanding white metal sign with 2 words printed in large black letters. "Turn back." Scott frowned. He approached the sign, touched its surface. Smooth, clean, colder than the surrounding air. He turned around. Another sign had appeared behind him. Same design, same message. "Turn back." Scott's pulse quickened. He stepped backward, away from both signs, trying to understand what was happening. The world didn't shift or distort. It remained perfectly still, like a paused film. Then a man appeared 20 feet away. No sound announced him. One moment the motorway was empty. The next, he stood there calmly. He looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Ordinary clothes, ordinary height. Nothing unusual except the way he watched Scott with a focused, unwavering expression. Scott took a step toward him. "Who are you?" he asked, voice shaking despite himself. The man didn't answer the question. Instead, he said, "You've been running from yourself for too long." Scott felt something in his chest tighten. What's that supposed to mean? The man walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Every road you take moves you forward, but none of them return you to the places you've avoided. Scott looked at the signs. "Turn back." He swallowed. "I don't avoid anything." The man stopped a few feet from him. "You avoid everything that matters." Scott bristled. "That's not true." The man didn't raise his voice. "You left conversations unfinished. You left apologies unsaid. You left people behind without explanation. You told yourself distance would fix what closeness broke." Scott's heart pounded. Memories rushed through me. Arguments I never resolved. Calls I never returned. Letters I drafted but never sent. I forced a scoff. "I'm just trying to live my life." "You're trying not to feel anything," the man replied quietly. "Why am I here? This is the direction my life has taken. Constant motion with no destination." I clenched my jaw. "You think moving forward is the same as growing. It isn't." I exhaled shakily. I wanted to deny everything. I wanted to dismiss this as a hallucination. I wanted to claim I was fine. But the silence around me held the truth I'd avoided. I was lonely, deeply, painfully lonely. I hadn't said that word aloud in years. So what am I supposed to do? Turn back. Turn back to what? The people I walked away from, the parts of myself I abandoned, the life I left unfinished. I felt something inside me crack. Not physically, but like a wall collapsing after years of pressure. I tried to speak, but my voice broke. It's not too late, but I cannot move forward. until I repair what's behind me. Turn back before there's nothing left to return to." Scott sucked in a sharp breath. He was in the cab of his truck again, slumped over the wheel. Rain beat against the windshield. A paramedic was speaking urgently, checking his pulse. "Sir, can you hear me?" Scott nodded weakly. He was taken for evaluation, monitored overnight, and discharged with instructions to rest. He didn't tell the medical staff about the motorway. He didn't mention the signs. He didn't describe the man who spoke truths he had spent years outrunning. He kept the experience close. But in the weeks that followed, his life changed. He called his daughter, really called her, and apologized for the distance between them. He reached out to his brother after 5 years of silence. He rebuilt friendships he thought were beyond repair. He spoke more honestly. He listened more carefully. He stopped pretending he didn't care. He still drove trucks, still traveled long distances, but he no longer used the road to escape the people who mattered. When friends asked why he'd changed, he always gave the same quiet answer: "I realized I had to go back before I could go forward." He didn't speak of the empty motorway, or the signs, or the man who understood him too well. He carried only the message: turn back. These stories cannot be verified scientifically. They are not medical statements. They do not claim supernatural truth. They are simply personal experiences, retold exactly how the individuals remember them. But across the United States and the United Kingdom, people who survived critical moments say something similar. During the seconds when they thought everything was ending, something told them their life still had meaning. Whether these moments were dreams, survival responses, or something we have not yet understood, the effect is undeniable. Every one of them came back believing the same thing: life feels different when you think you've already lost it. And sometimes, that is the message.